Welcome, everybody. Glad you can make a little bit of time in your day on what I could only imagine for everyone is an extremely busy and disconcerting time. My name is Greg Chapman. I'm a partner with Womble. I work the supply chain management initiative we have at our firm and started that a number of years ago with our other panelists, his assistants. And I would like to welcome Dr. Rob Handfield. Um, Rob is the Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management at the Poole College of Management at North Carolina State University, just down the road from where I'm sitting today in Greensboro. Rob is also the Executive Director of the Supply Chain Research Resource Cooperative, housed at NC State, and provides advice to companies all over the globe in supply chain management. I've had the pleasure of knowing Rob for, Rob, I guess it's over 10 years now. Um, Rob helped our firm with supply chain management as we sought to focus some of our legal expertise on that area and to find a better way for our lawyers to participate with our clients for whom supply chain management was even back then a growing and very important component of profitability and operations. So we're going to talk today about supply chain management, supply chain disruption as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis. I don't need to tell anybody on this call that this is uncharted territory, both in breadth and depth and the speed with which things are changing. And we're going to walk through some of the key things that we're observing, get Rob's take from a broader view of what's happening out there, what areas are being hit harder maybe than others, what companies can do to try and mitigate some of that disruption, and then hopefully look forward and see what's coming down the pike and things that may be able to occur now that will place companies in a better position as we ultimately will get past this giant disruption and crisis. So I hope everyone participating is doing well and staying safe. I assume most people are probably working remotely, as a lot of us are now. We do have a Q&A function on the webinar that you'll see on your screens. If you have a question, please use that functionality, and we'll try and get to them as we go through. So with that, let's get started. So I want to start with sort of a top level view of what we're seeing in supply chain out there. A broad perspective, both in the U.S. and globally. And Rob, I'm just going to turn it over to you and get your initial, take on what you're seeing in terms of a broad picture of the supply chain disruptions.
Hi, Greg. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and a pleasure to just share with people some of my thoughts regarding what's going on. I think in answer to that question, there's a lot of stuff going on as it relates to the supply chain right now, as you can well imagine. In fact, supply chain is an area that often people don't think much about. They just assume when they go to the grocery store, their stuff is going to be there. And lo and behold, you go there now and there's no toilet paper, there's no paper towels. And you can see the price jumps have gone through the roof. And I think all of a sudden this has really put the supply chain in the spotlight. And this is occurring for a number of reasons. Number one, we're seeing that there's kind of a mode where people go into there's a fear of shortage, kind of a scarcity thing that goes on. And all of a sudden, when people start thinking about the idea of being quarantined for weeks, or it's now much more likely to be months at a time. There's a lot of fear about, what am I going to do if I can't leave the house? So this has driven up, sales of toilet paper, for instance, by 200%. I heard of a convenience store that was asking $10 a roll for it, if you can believe it. But and I think that there's a natural fear. More people are now working at home. They're at home more. More kids and college students are now also at home and are taking classes online from home. So all of a sudden, people say, "Gosh, if I'm going to be at home, I'm going to need a lot more peanut butter. I'm going to need a lot more water. I'm going to need hot dogs, just to feed these kids." And so there's huge amounts of demand and a lot of stockpiling going on right now across the board. The good news is that I think that as far as these, paper goods, for instance, I can tell you right off the bat, Procter and Gamble, that makes Charmin, Georgia Pacific, and others are producing around the clock. These are all local materials. They're local paper mills. So we're not going to run out of that stuff. So even though the store doesn't have it, you're not going to see that issue going up. What we will start to see is, the American economy is out of business right now. And so we're seeing a major shutdown of businesses that's we saw a huge jump in the unemployment. And so a lot of the bigger companies, I think, are well positioned. They've got enough cash to maybe run through this period. I mean, we were an exceedingly good economy before this happened. So fortunately, people, had a lot of cash and they were doing okay, but they're still halting shipments. They're still halting production. People aren't showing up to work. And so there's a lot of issues there. On the logistics side, there's difficulty in, continuing supply of products, at least in the industrial areas. And fast-moving consumer goods demand is going through the roof. So they're having a bonus time right now. But aside from that, there's a lot of challenges around getting people to show up for work, continuing operations, and in fact, a lot of companies are letting employees go. And the problem is, they want them to come back when the economy gets better, but they don't have the financing to do it. And this is particularly bad, for instance, in the restaurant business. Restaurants, operate sort of on a week by week basis in terms of cash flow. So they're having to let people go and aren't paying them, and that's a real big negative for the economy right now.
I saw in Supply Chain Digest an interesting article that described that the supply chain now, and this to emphasize your point that it is getting, a lot of attention, if not almost all the attention outside of the health care and therapy issues, but that the supply chain has now become sort of what's called, the thin line between law and order and social and civil anarchy. Because as you point out, when folks go to the grocery store, there's nothing there. You start getting that natural reaction that people have when they get panicked, and so the logistics sector, food production, food packaging, all of those are going to be critical not only for the obvious benefits of getting food to people, uh, but also to make everyone feel that everything's okay, and there's no need to panic because we're still getting our peanut butter and
Um, okay, yeah, I agree, Greg. That's a good point. I think that's something that is going to continue. I think we'll be okay in terms of food supply, but there are other areas that I'm much more concerned about right now.
sure. And that leads us to the next question. Are we seeing specific sectors and industries that are being hit harder than others? And I think obviously yes. Um, but are we seeing some that maybe aren't suffering as bad or maybe having an uptick?
Well, the areas that are really being impacted right now are medical equipment, and specifically, masks and face shields, as well as ventilators. Hospitals are being inundated in places like New York, and they are going to be inundated in other places around the country as well. For instance, and I think there's going to be a shortage of healthcare workers also. There's a recent study that came out by the University of Washington that says that at its peak, We're going to be short across the country for about 64,000 beds, about 17,000 ICU beds. We will be short about 20,000 ventilators. And, as a result, we're going to be in this very difficult situation of having people die and having to, in some cases, put extreme pressure on our medical providers to decide, which ventilators, at what point ventilators get moved to other people who have a better chance of surviving. And so this, military hospitals are quite used to seeing this all the time, but for regular hospitals, it's going to be very difficult. Um, Part of the problem is, that we have outsourced a lot of the production of these goods to other countries. Masks, over half the world's masks are produced in China. And so I wrote a blog on the fact that, China during its peak was sucking up all the masks in the world. And now that they've leveled off, they haven't yet started releasing them, although we're starting to see shipments of masks. Likewise, one of my biggest concerns is ventilators. I'm on several task forces that are looking at ventilators in general. I think in the last couple of days, we've seen a lot of news around ventilators. First we had GM, talk about its willingness to produce ventilators, and then Donald Trump later used the Defense Production Act to tell them to order them to begin producing ventilators, and to do so in their Lordstown facility that they had closed, which actually has already been sold to somebody else. The problem is it's not that easy just to switch over, to start producing ventilators.
Right.
And so there's a lot of issues around, just production issues and component issues associated with this. And a lot of these components also come from places like China.
It's interesting that the Defense Protection Act's gotten a lot of press over the last week because it's been, bandied about by the White House and others. And as of, I guess, yesterday, it really hasn't been formally enacted, as I understand it. President Trump sort of walked that back a little bit, but that act came into being in World War II, and it was sort of the way we went from having our automakers change from producing cars to producing tanks. Um, but as you point out, modern production, heavily automated, a lot of, computer assisted machining that requires, software developed to make a part, cut a part, assemble the part, trained workforce that knows how to do that. And a standard ventilator, I read the other day, has 1,750 parts in it. Um, so you're not going to just go from making, lawnmowers to making ventilators.
Yeah, that's right. There's 750 to, I think some of them have 1,500 parts. And so there's real issues as to, how easy is it going to be to start producing ventilators. And yet, it's if the models are correct, this is an area we're going to continue to see, a real shortage, and that's of these ventilators. There's also some interesting, and a lot of it of the production, it's not the actual production of these goods, it's the components. For instance, masks, mask manufacturers, are trapped by price inflation of supplies as the cost of raw materials is also skyrocketing. So, melt-blown cloth has increased by 15 times, nose bridges 10 times, ear bands by 15 times. And there's certain most of the companies that produce this cloth that's used in the masks is in China. So China is starting to get back online. But what has also complicated this is we're seeing a lot of countries are restricting exports of medical equipment, machines, and masks.
Right.
So they want to restrict it for themselves. It's kind of like in a pandemic. It's every man for himself. And the result is that you're not getting shipments of components and raw materials crossing borders, or much less so than in the past. Another
Rob,
good
while we're in the
example.
middle of this crush right now, one of the things that I've wondered about, would love your opinion on, if we get through this, let's say, in the next couple months, or we kind of break the curve and start on the path to recovery, what does Christmas look like this year? Typically, if we back in the days when we had port closings, we had the port of LA closed in the summer about was it 19 or 2006 or so, and and the ripple effect of that was felt at Christmas because the shipping that had to occur, the production that had to occur to put things on shelves at Christmas happens in the summer, and so I wonder if we're going to get a sort of a second economic tumble if we hit Christmas time, and these delays we're experiencing now manifest then, and a lot of retail can make up to 50 or 60% of their annual revenue in the holiday season.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to impact Christmas, definitely. I don't think production will be able to ramp up in time. But also, I think, for a big part of the country, people's budgets will be curtailed significantly because of, being unemployed for an extended period of time.
Hmm.
And so I think there's going to be a shortage of demand as well. I think it's going to be a rough year overall in terms of requirements and demand and revenue. And I think there's definitely going to be a lot of closures for small businesses. They're going to, unless there's some kind of funding that can get them through at least the next 3 months. It's going to be difficult for them to stick around, and so I think we'll see a lot of small business closures and a lot of people on unemployment, which will definitely impact demand for goods going forward.
Right.
Um, it's ironic because the supply chain here has such an impact, even in like the pharmaceutical sector. A lot of the drugs we take are produced, from active pharmaceutical ingredients, which, I mean, again, many of those are made in China. So we're seeing actually even shortages of consumer goods like Tylenol because the APIs aren't yet available or are still in production. So there's a huge ripple effect going on here across multiple industries, and people have to start thinking, in terms of what's happening in their end-to-end supply chain, not just what's happening in their local business here.
Right. And complicating that, as you see on the slide here, the last bullet, we're getting a number of states now implementing statewide non-essential business closures. And states that don't have statewide orders yet typically have individual county or city orders taking effect. And they all, attempt to identify non-essential businesses through a variety of definitions. One of the more common ones is a reference to the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and it published, over 10 years ago, its list of critical infrastructure sectors, uh, largely coming out of 9/11 and trying to get our arms around protecting essential aspects of the U.S. Industrial and infrastructure. So you're seeing these closures happen. There's a lot of businesses that can stay open because they are essential under these, but you've got kind of a mix of one state says it's this, one state says it's that. If your employees are in different counties, those counties may have different orders. So that's adding to the confusion as well, and the ability to make sure you've got staff and the ability to operate, even in a very local sense. And then you broaden out to the global picture, and it just gets that much more challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue that, I think this is a time when people really need to build a task force around business continuity planning and try to figure out, what are we going to do about our supply chain? What parts of our business are going to be impacted, and start putting in mitigation plans now. And if you're not thinking through these issues as a business, you're going to be in trouble when these events start unfolding, as they most certainly will.
So at this point, what can a company do to mitigate? You're in the midst of this. It's we can't go back in time and create disruption plans now. We sort of we have to deal with the cards we have. In addition to the breadth and scope of these disruptions, you and I talked about this before the call. This has all happened in such rapid fashion. You think about 2 3 weeks ago, this wasn't that top of mind for a lot of people, and now it's every day it changes. So what can companies be doing, do you think, to start mitigating some of the disruption they're seeing with their supply chains?
Well, no, that's a great question, Greg. And actually, I wrote a report on how companies should prepare and react during a pandemic, and that was written in 2010 during the last SARS epidemic. Um, and I interviewed a whole bunch of different enterprises and talked to them, and there were some common themes that came out. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to establish, some team governance, your supply chain governance. At least, you should at least be looking at how do we ensure business continuity for critical parts of our supply chain. And let's make sure we have good representation from all the people that could be impacted. So that includes HR, it includes our facilities people, it includes our IT infrastructure. And I think we need to really think through that. A second big piece is, thinking about your supply chain and IT risk planning. What are the critical risks? What are the critical suppliers? What are the critical employees that could be impacted by a stay-at-home or shelter-at-home type of initiative? And what will that limit them in terms of their capabilities, their ability to do their job? Do we have all the IT resources made available with redundancies? And then let's look at failure points. Let's do some what if analysis around that. And then I think we need to start looking and see where can we add redundancies? Where can we increase our stockpile of either material or hire extra or pay overtime for extra people or extra employees, whether it's call centers or what have you, and put in place some of those excess resources to deal with that. And then I think that the last thing, which is the most important, is communication, communication, communication. We really need to really get people talking a lot more frequently. Having leadership talk to people, listen to their problems and issues, and respond to them. So I think those are things that everybody needs to be doing right now. And I wish we had more of that kind of activity going on at a federal level, but it's still really important for organizations to do that as well.
Sure. I saw an article recently from a major healthcare hospital chain that said they were having weekly meetings with their key suppliers and vendors, telephone meetings, to talk about inventory, what anybody could do to get more product moving or where the shortages were happening, and just to communicate every week about what was happening. Said that was paying dividends for them. So I think that's important for any company to look at your key suppliers and just have those very routine calls just to touch base.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
The other interesting part, yeah, we're starting to see some financial solutions coming. Obviously, we saw the large um, um, federal program finally got voted in, which is going to provide financial assistance, obviously directly to individuals, but also provide SBA loans to small businesses, um, and then direct payments to larger companies. But individual companies can get involved in that as well. I saw that Lockheed Martin was creating its own fund of, I think, $50 million to be able to provide funding to its supply chain, small and medium-sized companies, to make sure their critical parts could keep flowing. So I think there's some opportunity there, and I don't know if you've seen much in the way of that.
No, absolutely. During the last major SARS event, I actually ran a survey, and I found that organizations that are communicating more frequently with suppliers, especially looking at their financial situation, how much working capital do you have? How much free cash flow do you have? Um, what's happening in terms of your production line with your employee base? Having those kinds of discussions will be really critical. And if you're not doing those things, then you could come back in 6 months and find out, well, our tier one critical supplier is now out of business. They didn't make it. And that's worse because then we're not going to be able to restart the economy, and when we step on the gas, are not going to be able to get going again. So I think it's really important to have those discussions with suppliers to be proactive, and if necessary, refer them. There's a lot of activity going on in the supply chain financing sector right now, and several firms are creating a COVID supply chain financing program to help suppliers get access to capital that's going to help them make it through this period. And working capital is a big deal right now for a lot, especially small to medium sized businesses.
Sure. I'd like to revisit briefly this notion of conversion of production. We talked about the difficulty of going to high tech, high complexity items like ventilators, but I wonder your thoughts on converting what you can. I saw that Cisco, the food service company, was pivoting to support delivery to retail grocery stores compared to what they normally do, which is, delivering food products to restaurants and hotels and entertainment venues. And that struck me as a good example of taking what you already do, adjusting a little bit within the bounds that you're capable of to find a different market to serve. And I wonder your thoughts on how realistic that is to convert and what things companies might, how to assess that properly.
I think there's definitely, it's definitely possible in some areas and not as easy in others. A great example is General Motors and Ventec. General Motors stepped up and said, we're gonna convert our Kokomo, Indiana facility into a production line for ventilators. And the issue is, of course, you've got to have clean rooms. You've got to have people who are measuring. There's quality audits and specifications that have to be met. You don't just start a production line and start building ventilators. And 95% of the components, actually, GM went to their suppliers and said, can you make these? And people said, yeah. But it takes time to start up these injected molded parts and everything like that. So it's complicated in that situation. On the other hand, I think there's some areas where that there's definitely a possibility, and it could actually help support some of these industries that are getting the hardest hit. A good example is I think that a lot of hotels that have zero business right now could start leasing their facilities to hospitals and converting them into makeshift hospitals. I mean, there's a lot of real estate, for Hilton Garden Inns and Marriott's and everything else that really could convert those rooms into a hospital and a care facility, and to be able to house physicians and medical staff at the same time. So I think that's another opportunity. We're also seeing a lot of the airlines starting to ship more and more medical products and move much more to almost like a UPS type of model of shipping equipment. So there's opportunities, and I think you have to be creative and innovative during these times to try to find new ways of dealing with these kinds of things. And I think the other point is I think we're seeing some really interesting medical technologies that are also being experimented with around ventilators. A
Hmm.
good example is high flow oxygen therapy, which increases oxygen to compensate for a patient's own impaired respiration, and it's using different equipment that wasn't normally assigned to that kind of thing. And then also, Gilead is working on a drug that was originally targeted for Ebola that's now being converted over as a possible solution for COVID. So this is happening everywhere right now, and people American industries in particular are getting very creative in the way they're looking at these things.
That's great. Then one last thing I wanted to touch on this slide is the force majeure event. When we talk about mitigating, companies that we've been talking to that are having difficulty either staying open, or they're losing production capacity, or they can't ship what they do make. because of either personnel challenges or they don't have their logistics or 3PLs aren't able to perform. Almost, every contract I've ever looked at in the supply chain space has a force majeure clause. That's the one that says if something happens beyond a party's control, they're sort of relieved of their obligation to perform during the length of that act of God, if you will. And so
Mhm.
those can be helpful, but they've been boilerplate for so many years, and now they've become front and center, and folks are looking at that. And I wonder, in your talking with companies, if those kinds of declarations and delay, forgiveness are being used.
Well, I think they are being used, but I think that, again, it goes back to my experience and, my personal view of how supply chains operate in my 30 years is I think relationships matter. I think that if you have a good relationship with your supply chain partner, you've treated them fairly, you've paid them on time or they've paid you on time, and you have regular communication, you're going to stick together and you're going to find a way to get through this without having to revert to, throwing up your hands and saying force majeure, sorry, dude, that's it. I think, and we saw this in 9/11 where American Airlines, was literally shut down and talked to their suppliers and said, we need help with you guys to get through this. And they were there for them. And I think that's the basis of this. I think you're better off communicating and working with your, with other enterprises, communicating frequently, daily if need be, and thinking creatively about solutions to get through this together, as opposed to saying, well, force majeure is on the contract and there's not much we can do about it, right?
Right, right, agreed. I wanted to toss this up quickly. This came out of a McKinsey briefing way back on March 16th, which already feels like a lifetime ago. But this was a few things in a study and a survey they did. We've talked about a number of these. One of them I wanted to get your thoughts on was the inventory management because the thin supply chain, the lean global supply chain we've all lived with for the last 2 decades at least, I guess, is really now the part that's hard to absorb this disruption. And I know a couple clients that I've talked to are starting to get orders or are starting to order themselves critical parts to build buffer inventories. And I wonder your views on that as a good mitigation technique or not.
Well, I think the issue, and there's been a lot of press around criticizing lean and criticizing just in time. The issue in my mind isn't the lean part. It's really about we've gone to these low cost global supply chains. We've migrated to the lowest price, and we've sourced overseas, to locations with very low cost labor. And then when there's a major problem, the lead times are enormous to get the stuff, and it's in a different country, it's under different regulations, and you've lost control essentially of your supply chain. So I think the issue is more around, should we be thinking about, understanding who is in our supply chain? And that's not an easy task. I mean, there was an article in HBR, a colleague of mine, Tom Choi, just wrote it this week, and he's arguing, it's you can't just map out your supply chain, but you have to start thinking about that. You have to look at your tier one, your tier two, your tier three suppliers. You need to create greater visibility, and that visibility, when you can see the problem, it drives velocity, and velocity is the key of what you want to get to. And this is something that Tom Linton wrote about in our book called The Living Supply Chain. Is we really emphasize that velocity and visibility are the key in this environment where there's so much complexity, and then something like this comes along. If you don't have visibility, it's very difficult to manage what you can't see.
And so when you talk about velocity, I guess the logistics part of that is important. And one of the areas that we may be seeing more disruption as we go forward, we're seeing obviously the huge surge in online purchasing as folks are adhering to the shelter in place or stay at home orders. And Amazon's looking to hire 100,000 people. And that's, probably not going to go away anytime soon. And even when we get through this, the more people that have now gotten used to online shopping that maybe weren't doing it before, I think that that probably puts pressure on logistics, over the road trucking in particular, but our ports and air freight. And what how important is that is to the velocity part of the supply chain, and B, what can companies be thinking about to deal with that increased demand by others and the shortage that may occur?
Well, the move towards online demand and online shopping has been going on for some time now. And I think in the last year, we've noticed, increasing investment in warehouses and distribution centers close to major cities. And, BlackRock has been buying up these properties. And that's because of this move towards next day or same day delivery, the Amazon effect. That is being sort of escalated at this point. I mean, our family is using Amazon pretty much every day now, to order stuff when we need it. And but there's still risks, with the packaging, and there was a strike, or there was supposedly a strike today at the New York Amazon facility because they were making people work, around someone who had already been identified, or several people who had been identified as having the COVID virus. So, these supply chains are still fragile. They still need people to operate them. And so, these distributors and 3PLs are going to really have to think through what measures they're going to put in place to protect the safety of their employees, and to make sure that they can deliver to customers. And even like Peloton is not doing in-home installation; they're leaving it at the threshold now. So you're seeing, different ways of adapting to that's going on at the moment.
So, you know, now as a follow-on to that, since we don't know really how long this is going to last, not only how long the primary threat of the virus is going to last, but how long the disruption, immediate disruption, is going to last. So if we look down the road, 1, 3, 6, 12 months, um, what does disruption planning look like after this immediate effect? And how do companies alter their supply chain, or as some financial advisors say about the stock market, do you just hold tight and ride this out and try and make adjustments later? Is it something to try and do in the midst of this, or wait?
Well, I've got an interesting theory about that, Greg, and this is a theory, mind you, and I'm an academic, so sometimes we're out there. But there was an article that caught my eye recently, and it said, pandemic risks may be seasonable and predictable, with the accuracy of pre-pandemic and real-time risk assessments hinging on reliable seasonal influenza surveillance. So I think that this could very well happen again, not at this level, but I think there's the world. This is a new world. I think this has changed the world forever, and I think organizations are going to respond to that completely differently than they ever have before. And in my mind, I think that it's going to reshape not just business continuity planning, but it's going to redesign entire global supply chains. And this is something that I've been thinking about for the last 8 months. And it started with the Trump tariffs, and then Brexit, and then now this is exposing the weaknesses of global sourcing. Um, so I really believe that we're going to be moving much more towards what I would call sort of a localization strategy. I think that there's even the possibility that we may replace our current supply base. Now, that's going to be easier for some companies than others because we've outsourced to China, and that some of that work may never come back. But I think it'll force companies to rethink what they look like and to redesign them in some cases to have a greater local supply, especially for medical and healthcare and other kinds of devices. I think that is going to change forever.
Hmm.
So how to be flexible and nimble, like I said earlier, I think we have to be thinking about when this thing settles down. Well, that was a disaster, and let's hope that never happens again. It will happen again, and if it's not COVID, it's going to be some other kind of virus or some other kind of issue. So I think we have to really start thinking about how we're going to design our supply chains to create the greatest flexibility, the greatest redundancy, without having to just store a bunch of inventory everywhere. I think there's other solutions with technology, with predictive analytics, with supply market intelligence, other things you can do to really be better informed and to do it more quickly in real time.
And do you think having alternate sourcing strategies, if not to move everything, all your sourcing domestically, but to at least have alternate sources domestically for key, particularly for key materials and key components, so that maybe your primary source is still overseas due to the price advantages you can get there, but to have an alternate making a sufficient quantity to keep them sort of up to speed with the ability to then transition if you needed to.
Absolutely, I think we're starting to see the need for there's increased automation. There's a lot of 3D printing that's going on right now at North Carolina State. They're making different kinds of materials and masks there at the moment. I think there's emerging technology that can maybe not produce it at the same low cost, but at scale. We're talking to one organization that's also they kind of have a two-tiered supply chain. They've got their low and slow model, which is long lead times, low cost from Asia, but they're also having a local supply chain that's using automated equipment that can respond very quickly and nimbly and deliver a customized product in 48 hours. So, maintaining that dual level of capacity is one strategy that I think people are going to start thinking more about and making sure that they're never put in this position again of being at a complete standstill.
Sure. And then you wonder what the legislative reaction to all this will be, particularly as you mentioned with medical device and healthcare goods. Before I was a lawyer, I was an engineer in the military defense business. And, in that business, by federal law, you have to source virtually everything from U.S. companies because you don't want to rely on foreign companies to provide you with things that are necessary for weapon systems, that sort of thing. And I wonder what the legislative reaction may be to things like critical medical devices, and if they start, mandating that those have to be built in the U.S.
That may be something that I think we'll see more reshoring of that stuff. And actually, in my mind, I think we will start to see the emergence of what I would call regional trade platforms or regional trade zones. So, for instance, one trade zone might be, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Hmm.
And Mexico has plentiful, lower cost labor. Canada has huge amount of natural resources, including oil and gas and timber, and the U.S. has capital. And so I think, there could be very much of a regional platform or a regional trade zone between this area. Likewise, we could see the same thing in Europe and Eastern Europe and possibly, China and Southeast Asia. So I think we're going to move to a more regionalized global economy going forward.
So I wanted to touch base. I don't want to belabor this one because we have talked about it. But the shelter in place orders that are coming down, and we hear rumors about every 2 or 3 days that there might be a national order if we don't sort of flatten the curve on the virus. And I wonder again how this is going to impact businesses across the country particularly if they have, facilities in different states, um, and how easy or should the effort be made to try and redistribute, production and services and shift operations from one facility to the other, if that's even possible from a manufacturing sense, is that practical from a supply chain sense and the personnel that have to do that?
I think it's likely difficult to do that in the short term. And again, in the longer term, there might be, a lot of times these location decisions for facilities are made on the basis of what state is giving me the biggest, the biggest incentive. I think people are going to look at, well, how does that play into a national strategy in terms of business continuity as well? And redistribution may be difficult, but I think you should at least be looking at this from your network and starting to understand what makes the most sense and what's the lowest total cost and yet the greatest flexibility. And maybe we don't have to ship everything from the West Coast. Maybe we can ship it from regional distribution centers. So there's different approaches. The other big change I think that's going to happen, Greg, is I think with everyone working at home, I think that's going to increase in the future. I think we're going to see a lot more people working from home in the future, and that will continue after this epidemic goes through. I think we'll also start to see more local takeout, companies like Grubhub and so forth, and more online platforms. So people can work wherever they are. They can work. I mean, their mobile device now is almost the equivalent of a computer. So we're going to see a lot more mobile activity going on in the future, I believe.
Well, I know my employment colleagues at our firm are looking at the long-term effect that the remote working is going to have on employment law and things like what's a reasonable accommodation, because we're now sort of living the real-time experiment of remote working is possible, and a lot of people are doing it. So I think it will have a lasting.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about how we handle the crisis, how we survive during the crisis. But I love this Albert Einstein quote that in the midst of every great crisis lies great opportunity. So, we're going to get past this, and life will return to probably something different than it was 2 months ago, but back to some sort of normal. So, what is the opportunity for companies and their supply chains? What lessons can be learned here that lets them improve for day-to-day operations in the absence of a COVID pandemic or other, national crisis? But what things can we learn and implement now that will allow a company to work even better and more profitably once we get through this?
Right. So I really think that a number of things are going to happen. I think for a long time there was sort of the death of lean, if you will, and I think we're starting to see now a limited resurgence of lean, efficient, local inventory and management. And I think we're going to start to see a restructuring of supply chains around networks of local facilities and their supply base that will become increasingly independent, yet I mean still connected at a global level with global design, global planning, global systems, and global connectivity, but also a local source of supply, local source of components, more dialogue and relationship management at a local level as well. And I think if that's one of the things that comes out of it, well, that may be a good thing because that's something that I've been a big proponent for my entire career is the need for relationship management between key parties in the supply chain. And I think it can solve a lot of the ills of problems with materials and quality and actually can avoid a lot of the lawsuits that I've been involved in, where it gets into a he said she said kind of thing,
Hmm.
and I think there's an opportunity here to redesign supply chains in such a way to drive collaboration, to drive communication, to drive information sharing, to get away from price discussion and to focus on cost minimization and total cost minimization. To build this thing called trust between buyers and sellers, and to find new ways of collaborating through some of this technology that allows greater visibility of information and allows people to make decisions based on data, not just on intuition or gut feel. So I think there's definitely an opportunity here, and it'll be interesting to see how this comes together. I think it's unfortunate that we have, gone to this level of pain, and the death toll is going to be horrible here. But there may be something that comes out of it for the people that see what goes on afterwards.
You raised an interesting point that one of the key drivers of the lean supply chain that we had leading into this crisis was, largely driven by a price analysis. And you know, from your perspective, particularly in looking at all the companies you advise and through your academics, do you think we're going to displace price as the primary driver in supply chain, finally, and look at these other criteria that are going to be important? And really, the question there is, will there be the business case, the business rationale to say we're going to move some of this back? We're going to onshore it now because it was great to have cheap labor, but cheap labor is only one piece of the puzzle. And we now recognize what the other important pieces are.
Yeah, I think it's going to focus much more on value. I wrote a book with Gerard Chick called The Procurement Value Proposition, and I think that's the value proposition is it's not about price, it's about cost. And we extract the components of cost that we can impact on price, and make sure that everyone is making decent margins and can support reinvestment in their business, and that we can drive the greatest efficiency and the greatest customer value. And I think, price has nothing to do with value. Price is much more focused on just, a contract negotiation. And so I think we have to get away from price and start focusing on value as a key component of these relationships.
Well, that's most of our covered material. I also want to invite any questions that anyone has through the questions panel. We can take those now. If you have questions later, obviously our contact information is here for both Rob and myself. Please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us. Also wanted to point you to a few resources on this page. First and foremost, we have a blog at the SCRC. I think you'll find that very informative. It's one of my great sources. Also, we have a COVID hub at Womble Dickinson that captures a lot of this information that we're presenting. In addition, we have a sort of an interactive mapping function for the state essential business issues and closure orders that I think could be useful. And then the supply chain resource cooperative site itself that has a lot of great information. Rob, while we're talking about information, any particular sources that you're paying close attention to these days?
I read the New York Times every morning just to see what's going on, and they've been doing a great job. They've made that available to everybody, and they're doing a great job on everything that's going on, Corona related, and increasing coverage of the supply chain as well. Things are moving so quickly, though, Greg. To be honest, I'm on a lot of calls during the day, and I'm learning something new on every call, and the picture is changing very rapidly. So.
Yeah, we were talking before this call. I said that the number of things that I read every morning, I've gotten in the habit of deliberately double checking the timeline of whatever article I'm reading, because if it's more than about 5 days old at this point, it may not be relevant any longer. So trying to keep track of all this is very hard. And I read the Times every day too, and I do find they're expanding coverage of this, and particularly to supply chain issues and Defense Procurement Act and some of those things was particularly well done.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. No, and
I think that'll,
If
Go ahead.
anyone wants to, talk to me as well on any specific issue, I'd be happy to help out any way I can. I think a lot of people are faced with a lot of different challenges right now. So anything I can do to help, happy to do that.
Great. Well, and Rob is an invaluable resource. He has seen more things across more industries and supply chain management than I could possibly describe to you. So appreciate that offer, Rob. And want to thank everybody for participating in this today. Hope you found it helpful and informative. Please don't hesitate to reach out to either of us with any questions you have. We will make the audio recording and the slides available to all the participants. That should be ready probably late tomorrow. And again, if there are any questions you have after you ponder all that you've heard today, please reach out to either one of us. With that, Rob, my many thanks for your participation in this and your help, and I hope you and your family and friends stay safe.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. You too.
Okay, thank you, everybody.